Hello, good morning. It's Beth from Ruth Stitchery and ruthstitchery.com. And first I want to start, last week we mentioned that we had a goal of 10,000 followers on our Facebook page, and we asked for your help, and it's working. In less than a week, we have 500 more followers on our Facebook page, thanks to you guys. So thank you for watching our videos, sharing our videos, and asking your quilting friends to watch our videos. We really try to come up with topics that people ask us about. They mention to us that they'd love to see videos on certain things, and we're trying to meet all of those needs. So today we thought, we've had a couple of people ask us this, so we thought, it's been in our little queue to do, and what we want to talk about today is choosing a long arm quilter. What are some of the questions you should ask a long arm quilter? What does a long arm quilter need? So I have Denise with me today because she does this as a business as well with her daughter, and thought she would give us some great insight. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. And if you are local, we don't provide that service here in our store, but we do have a local long arm quilters list that you can pick up in the store, or we will email it to you if you need. But we know a lot of you aren't here in Colorado, and so we want you to be able to find a long armor and know what to ask them. So my first thing as the quilter, because I don't have a long arm and I'm too busy to quilt my own quilts most of the time. So I know that when I'm looking for someone to long arm my quilt, there are certain things that I want to find out. So of course, the first thing is, how much do they charge? So every long armor is going to charge a little bit different, and so that's a question that you need to ask. Usually that charge is by the square inch, so it depends on how large your quilt is, and they will charge like pennies per square inch. And so I wanted Denise to kind of share with, why are there some differences? Like, I'm sure you have different prices for different things. So what is the difference?
Well, the difference is if it's an edge to edge or an all over pattern, it's based on how dense that pattern is and how much thread that the quilt would use. That's a question also to ask, is if the thread is included in the price. Okay, most long armors can tell you that up front. So for instance, if you brought it to us, the price is based on how dense the pattern is, because then it uses more thread. We don't charge additional for thread, but if that's what bases the price.
So you include it in your price per square inch?
Yes, but some don't, so that's another difference. Okay. And then also, if you're doing custom work is takes a lot of time and skill, and the price per square inch is it goes up pretty
and I found
significantly.
Sometimes it's doubled.
At
doubled
least
what it would be.
And it is a skill, and it takes a long time to custom quilt a quilt. So that's kind of how the pricing is ranged.
And I'll be honest, most of the quilts that I have quilted, it's an all over pattern, but there are some times where I really want a custom quilt on my quilt because it's wool applique or whatever, and I don't really care how much it costs. It's worth every penny to me when I get it back. So that's the first one. What do they charge? Okay. So then the other one is time frame. Like, is there a backlog? Do they have a list? Do they, I know some will have you call, they put you on your list. They don't want your quilt until you're, up on their list. They don't store them. So do you want to talk a little bit to that, as to, do you go ahead and take their quilt, or do you do a list?
Well, we have both, meaning for us, it doesn't matter if your quilt is hanging in my closet or under your sewing machine. Once you're on our list, we just need the quilt X amount of days prior to the due date is where we like to have it.
Okay. And so, that is something you're going to have to take into consideration if you're the quilter. If you have a baby shower coming up in 2 weeks and you need this baby quilted, but the person you call has a 6-month backlog, then maybe you have to say, okay, I'll use that that quilter another time, I've got to find someone who doesn't have the backlog. But Denise and I were also talking about kind of some of those emergency situations. Yes. That's something else. If it's sort of a very, well, we talked about someone in hospice care, if you were making a quilt for them and there's really a critical timeline there, it doesn't hurt to ask that long armor, is there any way I can button line? Is there any way I can kind of jump the line? And it's a question that you can ask. So I'm sure some long armors will make an exception based on probably the size of your quilt and the situation that's at hand. Okay, so the other thing is, and people ask us this all the time, how much backing and batting do I need to go with my quilt to take to a long armor? And a lot of people don't realize that if I'm going to quilt this quilt myself, I know I need about 1 or 2 inches all the way around because the quilt's going to flatten as I quilt it. But a long armor typically needs more than a couple of inches all the way around. So I wanted to ask Denise, like, why is that? So usually my experience is it's usually like 3 to 5 inches all the way around more. Can you tell us why a long arm quilter would need that much?
Yes, what we recommend is 6 to 8 inches. So if your quilt is 50 square, we'd like it 56 by 56 or 58 by 58, the back. And the reason is when you load the quilt, you need the back to be larger so that when you're pinning the back, you can drop down the top so that your top fits inside the backing. And that way too, we have clamps on the sides that helps to hold your back flat. Right. And if there's nothing to grab onto, the long arm also can kind of hit the clamps. So you need a good amount of space on the outside.
Right, so you don't want those clips hitting your quilt top.
Or the long arm, because the long arm will slide. And normally edge-to-edge patterns, it does stitch beyond the quilt top. It doesn't stop right at the edge. So because it's quilting beyond it, you want your backing to be larger and your batting to be slightly larger than your quilt top.
Okay. And that's something I didn't realize, and we were talking about it this morning. I always kind of just thought, okay, I know my backing needs to be this big. My batting needs to be that big as well. But Denise was mentioning that usually, if it isn't already, you trim down the batting to be somewhere in the middle of the quilt top and the backing itself. So the backing is really what the clamps are going to clip onto. So. Okay, so I just finished this beginning quilt. I redid it, and so I've just finished it. It's ready to be long-armed, and so I brought it in. And so the first thing I realized that I needed to do was really press this quilt and get it as flat as I can get it. I'm looking at it right now and probably could do a little bit better. It was folded up coming here. So you need to really press it as flat as you can get it. And then, of course, I have measured it. It's 44 inches square. And so I know I need about 52 inches of backing. So I haven't quite decided on what my backing is, but this is a regular 44-inch wide that I had in my stash. It's almost 3 yards. It will not be quite enough. I think it's going to be, it would give me 54, and I need 52 is what I said, right?
Yeah, it was going to be a couple inches
It's
shy.
Just a couple inches shy. So I might just have to sew some leaders on if I decide to go with this one so that there's something for them to grab onto. This is 108-inch wide, and so I would just have to make sure I got the length. So probably about 1 yard and 2/3 is what I would get, and then I'd have plenty because I'd have 108, and then it would be the width. So, however, I would still need to press either one of these as best as I can. So it's very difficult, I imagine, for a long armor to get something that's very wrinkled, because then that's extra time, because they're not going to put that on their long arm wrinkled, because then it's going to buckle in the back.
It could tuck, yeah, and you wouldn't be happy with the end result.
Yeah. So I like best press. Some people like to just kind of squirt a little or mist some water and get it really nicely pressed. These 108s, they're folded 4 times, and so there's some creases in there that you'll want to get out. So I know that is my next step. And then I know that because of the size I need, the throw size batting is what I needed to get. We've done a video on batting, so you could go back and look at that video, but I chose white because my background is white and I want it to stay bright. And then I chose the Select, which is a little bit thicker just because I like the drape and how it hangs. Okay, I think I've covered everything on here as to what I would ask a long armor. Is there anything I've missed? Anything that you find that sometimes happens that you maybe have to call a customer back?
I think the main thing too is to make sure if your quilt is not square when you bring it to your quilter, it's not going to be square when you get it back.
No.
So just keep that in mind. And your borders, and I know this isn't a lesson on borders, but it is a problem with long armors, is you really want to measure your border before you sew it on, because if you sew it on, your feed dogs are kind of stretching the fabric. So an example is I had a customer bring me a king size quilt and I loaded it, and that border was so wavy. I unloaded it, gave it back to the customer. When she measured, it was about 6 inches more. So it was a king size quilt, so it was a large quilt, but it really can. And if your long armor goes ahead and tries to quilt that, that's too much extra fabric to try to work in, and you might get a tug.
Right. You're not a miracle worker.
No.
You're not a miracle worker. So that brings up a good point that I didn't mention. When I said measure your quilt, you really should measure the top, the middle, and then the bottom, and that will really tell you.
Yes.
And I've always been told, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're kind of within an inch, those measurements, the top, middle, and the bottom, if you're within an inch difference in all of those measurements, then you're probably pretty safe that your quilt is going to stay flat.
Yes.
And that. But if you start getting more than an inch, inch and a half, and of course more than that, that is when you're going to start to have some pleats in your border and that kind of stuff.
Or they'll kind of frown on you at the bottom. So when we go to base the bottom to stitch past it's going to kind of frown at you. Okay. And that's a little bit too much to square up and still look nice.
Well, this is fantastic. I learned something I didn't know. Hopefully you guys learned the questions you should ask when you're looking for a long armor, and what to do yourself before you bring your long arm when you bring your quilt to that long arm. You're not going to bring the long arm anywhere. All right. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully we've answered some of the questions that you guys had. Please don't forget to share our videos and follow us on Facebook.
Bye-bye.